Argyriou. So please, Meg, proceed.
Okay, no worries. Morning. It's great to be here. We're just waiting for my slides. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some work that we undertook earlier this year in partnership with Vivid Economics, who are a UK-based economics think tank, looking at opportunities for comparative advantage in 3 Southeast Asian middle-income economies. So we looked at Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And the reason for doing that, just so I can kind of get cracking, is, so in Southeast Asia, I think in a lot of developing countries, but this is certainly apparent in the countries in which we're doing some work in Southeast Asia, climate action is still seen as a trade-off with development outcomes. And so it's really important that we find a way to reframe that. You know, in Southeast Asia, emissions are growing faster than just about any other region in the world, so it's very, very critical to turn that trajectory around. And the region is also one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change as well. That's okay. So I'm going to touch very, very lightly on the work that we did today, and I'll have a slide at the end that refers you to our website where you can download those reports and have a look in more detail. But basically the objective is to show, is to sort of turn that argument on its head and to show that actually addressing climate change can create new opportunities for countries in terms of industrial growth. Which is really critical for those economies in their development pathways. And here we are. Thank you. Okay, so we all know the importance of stabilising global temperature rise, and as to my first point, that there is still this disconnect in many developing economies, about between their development objectives and achieving those, and action on climate change. And yet climate change is the economic growth story of the 21st century. The potential for economic stimulus, if we think about the size of investment needed. So Jeff Sachs yesterday mentioned a couple of times the 1% of GDP number. We think of it typically as a cost on our economy, but I think it's important to also flip that thinking and think about that as an investment. And so if we compare this to other sort of significant economic stimuli that we've had, sort of in our recent history, I think, World War II provides a good example. That's probably the greatest economic stimulus that the global economy has experienced, and it really ended the Great Depression. And the size of investment that we need to solve climate change is larger than that, so the potential benefits are potentially much greater. And so the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate did some analysis last year that found that there's about $90 trillion of investment in infrastructure that's required between now and 2030. And if that $90 trillion in investment prioritises green infrastructure over brown infrastructure, that would deliver an additional $26 trillion in value to the global economy. Compared to the brown infrastructure. And that in addition would create 65 million new jobs across the economy. So we know there's many benefits for doing it beyond solving climate change, although that's obviously the critical one and the reason why we're all here. And so the global market size for low carbon technologies is obviously going to grow very, very significantly over coming decades. And in our analysis with Vivid Economics, we did some very conservative estimates of the potential future size of that market. And we found very conservatively about a 6-fold increase between now and 2050 in the size of low carbon markets. So that's growing from about $1 trillion today to about $6 trillion in 2050. And so the question should be, how do countries get their fair share of that opportunity? How do they carve their niche in that growing market for low carbon technologies? What are the low carbon technologies that different countries have already, some sort of an opportunity or comparative advantage in? And that was the focus of the research that we did. So we built on a methodology that Vivid Economics had already developed, and we applied this to those 3 countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And the way to sort of think about it is this graph just provides a very simplified view of it. But we look at two key metrics. We look at innovation on the y-axis there, and we look at competitiveness, particularly around export competitiveness, on the x-axis across the bottom. And so what you want to do is, countries want to be above global average, which is the middle line on either axis. I can actually show you with my little dots. I won't do that. And so you want to, so for countries who are, innovating above global average, you can see that there's an opportunity up there on the left-hand side, and those are the sorts of things where they need to focus on increasing their export competitiveness, for example, in those types of technologies. And similarly, countries who are already very competitive from an export perspective can focus on increasing their innovation. And really the sweet spot that you're aiming for is that quadrant up there on the top right-hand corner, which is where countries are both innovating and have an export competitiveness in a given technology, and that represents a strength. And so when we look at a whole range of different regions across the world, you can see that Asia overall, if you think about the whole of the Asian region, is already performing incredibly well in terms of low carbon technologies. So you can see Asia just up there, just in the sort of bottom left-hand corner of the upper right quadrant. And you can see that they are already innovating well above the USA, and they are already more competitive than Europe. So they're already slightly ahead in the green race as a region as a whole. And when you then split out the three market leaders, which are South Korea, China, and Japan, you can see that those countries have a clear comparative advantage already in terms of low carbon technologies. And that's really what's driving Asia's position overall in that quadrant. And so that leaves developing Asia just sort of sitting just down there on the cusp of competitiveness. But that's actually quite a good place for them to be as developing economies. They have highly skilled yet low-cost labour forces. They're increasingly attractive to foreign investment, and their proximity to market leaders presents a really unique opportunity for them to find their niche in that supply chain. And the point is that those countries who get a head start today in low carbon technologies are the ones who will be the market leaders and the major global economies of tomorrow. And so this just looks at, from a technology perspective, Asia overall you can see is very, very strong in energy efficient lighting, energy storage, and in solar PV or photovoltaics. Overall, they perform quite well in all low carbon technologies, but those three are the standouts. And the reason I'm highlighting those is I'm just going to give you a very quick snapshot of the work that we did for Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. We've got those pretty graphs that we created for all of those, for each of those countries, but just to give you a little summary, you can see that their strengths are quite consistent with where Asia is heading overall. Solar PV showed up very strongly for Vietnam and the Philippines, lighting for the Philippines, and so on. But I do just want to highlight a few of the particularly interesting findings from this work. So the first, all countries are good at energy storage, and that's really due to their natural resource endowments that can be exploited to create opportunities around energy storage. So unusually and surprisingly for Indonesia, wind turbines. So anyone who knows much about the Indonesian context would know that there's barely any domestic wind industry within Indonesia, and yet wind turbines, they're actually already slightly ahead of the global average in terms of competitiveness. And the reason for this is that they have a good steel industry, and they are able to manufacture wind towers at 1/5 of the cost of China, which is quite surprising. So they're making wind turbines incredibly cheaply and exporting them, but they're not yet sort of using that expertise to grow their domestic market. Also surprisingly, in Vietnam, smart grids. So again, anyone who knows much about the Vietnam context would know that there's virtually no smart grid infrastructure in the country so far. And yet smart grids appeared already as a strength, so up there in the top right-hand quadrant for Vietnam. And the reason for this is because they already have such excellent capability around electronics manufacturing, and many of the components that are used in smart grids are the same components that are used in those electronics that they're already manufacturing very well. And this is probably a story that you've heard before, but just to reiterate, if you're a government that's focused on creating new jobs, then renewable energy is definitely a better focus, from a policy perspective than traditional fossil fuels. So this graph here shows the number of job years created per gigawatt hour of energy produced. And the height of the bars represents the range in terms of those job hours created. But you can see that energy efficiency and solar PV in particular represent quite significantly larger opportunities for jobs growth, as do all of the renewable energy technologies compared to fossil fuels. And there's a range beyond the very, very obvious ones of solving climate change and avoiding the impacts of climate change. There are sort of a range of other broader benefits that it's also worth highlighting for governments, businesses and society. So for governments, one of the key benefits is an improved fiscal position, and this really comes about through reducing fossil fuel subsidies, and that delivers much better outcomes in terms of the budget. And then for countries that are dependent on fossil fuel imports for their energy, energy security is also a key driver. So important to sort of tap into those types of storylines. And for businesses, the potential to tap into new export markets is a really fantastic one, and that obviously has broader benefits for the economy. And then, also addressing the risk of stranded assets as well. So improving economic diversification and helping businesses to think about how they can better prepare themselves helps to reduce that risk as well. And then finally, for society overall, as I've shown, a shift to low carbon technologies creates a whole lot of new jobs. It also creates better jobs. They tend to be cleaner and higher quality jobs. So that, again, that has benefits in terms of economic uplift for the community. And, the clear benefits from reducing air pollution as well. So just a quick case study from Indonesia, because I think this also really helps to bring it to life. So the New Climate Economy did some work that was released earlier this year in partnership with Bappenas, which is Indonesia's planning ministry. And they ran 4 scenarios looking at that sort of followed the end. There was a business as usual scenario, and then 2 scenarios that followed Indonesia's NDCs, and then a 4th scenario that pushed the envelope a little bit further. And what they found overall was that the harder Indonesia pushed in terms of climate and environmental outcomes, the better it was for their economy overall. And in fact, the most ambitious scenario delivered about an extra full percentage point in terms of GDP growth. Most surprisingly, though, is that the business as usual trajectory showed that Indonesia would experience a decline in its rate of GDP almost immediately. And so again, that's very contrary to the usual story that we sort of hear, that countries need to focus on development now for the in the immediate future and focus on climate at some later date. Just sort of to end, the green growth story is really the only plausible story, sort of economic growth story of the 21st century. And it's very, very important, I think, for countries to understand where their unique comparative advantages lie and to help them to prioritise those technologies and those industries that can help them achieve their dual objectives of development outcomes as well as solving climate change. And there's a link to the work that we did if you want to have a look in more detail. Thanks very much.